Hi everyone, I'm Max Diamond. Some of you may know me on YouTube as DJ Hammers. I'm a transit enthusiast and expert, and I also volunteer at the Transit Museum. We'll be taking a quick ride on the Q train from Coney Island all the way up to Astoria, and I'll be showing you some of the interesting things that you may not notice on your everyday commute. So here we are, Coney Island, Stillwell Avenue. Very striking train shed. It's got this arch sort of structure. The terminal was completely rebuilt in 2004. It used to be a large concrete structure with no canopy, and they basically tore the whole thing down and rebuilt it with this huge glass arch structure with solar panels on top. And the solar panels actually provide some of the station's electricity, which is, very, very interesting and definitely forward-thinking. Very impressive engineering. I think we'll probably, let's see if we could, we could get on this train here. All right. So we're going to be going all the way up to Astoria. We have a fine sign over here that stands for Flexible Information Display. And maybe in a couple minutes, the doors will close and we'll pass Coney Island, the amusement park, on our way up the Brighton line. Right around now, school's letting out, so we have these large crowds of people hopping on the train. All right, here we go. So we're going to proceed south just a little bit, and then we're going to make a left, and we're going to pass the Coney Island Amusement Park. That's Astroland, the Wonder Wheel, things like that. This area is kind of unique in that it has one of the only double-decker elevated structures. So we're going to be on the top level, and below us will be the F train. Definitely, something that's unique to just this area. So we're gonna take this curve here. There's the F train that's actually gonna be underneath of us. We're ramping up and he's ramping down. And then in the background we have the Wonder Wheel and all sorts of amusement park rides. This area has changed a lot in the last couple of years. Lots of redevelopment. So now, actually underneath of us, we can't really see it, but directly underneath of us is that F train we just saw. And we're kind of parallel right now. He's going to keep going with us until the next station, and then that F train is going to take a left and head towards Neptune Avenue. There's the Cyclone, world famous wooden roller coaster. Very fun, very rattly. All right. Westhafe is pretty cool because it's the only, double-decker elevated station. In the sense that you have two tracks that are parallel with each other.
This is a Manhattan-bound Q local train.
All right.
The next stop is Ocean Parkway.
So we're going to be on an elevated structure like this up until just before Sheepshead Bay. And then we're going to be on an embankment. There's actually something that's pretty interesting that you could see out the window here in a moment. So the lower level, the F train, will take a left and head up towards Neptune Avenue. But there used to be a connection between the two levels, and there's no track on this connection anymore, but you could see the ironwork, and we'll just kind of see it rise up to our right here in just a moment. Yeah, see there it is all the way down there, and it's going to meet us This area is also undergoing a lot of redevelopment. Yeah, so this little box girder structure here, that used to have track on it, and you used to be able to go from that lower level at West Eighth to this station here at Ocean Parkway. And that was torn out a long time ago, back in the 1950s or 1960s. Now we're passing over Ocean Parkway, and the beach is out there. Great boardwalk. Say again? That's Brighton Beach. Beautiful, beautiful beach. I spent a lot of my childhood out there. It was pretty heavily damaged during Sandy, but they rebuilt it. Say again? I'll give it to you. I have yours.
Oh, you have mine?
Yeah.
There's a meeting you might want to come to, a once-a-month meeting. You might find interesting.
All right.
Good luck.
Thank you.
This could be continuous, right?
The whole length.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Something you see it somewhere, or
Yeah, it'll be on the New York Post, on the Facebook. Yeah. Thanks. So actually, if you turn around here, this is the only stretch of 6-track elevated. There's 6 tracks. The 2 middle ones are, not normally used, but they're technically express tracks. We're on the outer local tracks. And then the 5th and the 2nd track, those are storage tracks. And B trains are usually stored on those during the midday. And then when rush hour comes along, those trains are put into service at Brighton Beach. Of course.
and I know somebody like that. It's not done.
Oh no, we're covering everything. We're covering everything.
Somebody I would have hooked you up with is Paul Madden.
Okay.
Have you heard of the name?
Yeah.
Yeah. Die Hard Brighton like that.
Yep.
Okay.
All right. Have a safe trip, by the way. So this is Brighton Beach. There's a transfer to the B train over here. The B is express, and we're going to be local. And this is the terminal for the B train. So there's a crossover switch just north of here, so the B trains can access either track at Brighton Beach Station and can go back north on the northbound express. So now we're going to take a bit of a left turn here, and soon we're going to transition from this elevated structure to an embankment. It's almost more like a commuter rail line in a way. All right. Now this is all construction from the 1910s and 1920s. As part of this thing called the dual contracts, they had this private company called the BRT and another private company called the IRT. And they were in competition with each other, but they collaborated on this big project called the dual contracts to build and expand the subway system significantly. So the BRT, and they later reorganized to become the BMT, which is Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, basically took this steam railroad right-of-way that was along the route that we're on now and just rebuilt it into this large 4-track wide main line. So while the route itself is very old and dates back to the 1800s, almost all of the infrastructure is from 1910 to 1920. This is another area with a lot of development. There's a massive skyscraper coming up here. A lot of things have changed. Now this structure that you see over here, there used to be a Long Island Railroad line that paralleled the Brighton line, which is the line we're on now. And once in a while, you'll see this extra space on the right side, and that's where the Long Island Railroad used to run. On the same embankment, it would share the right-of-way. That's long gone.
today.
Yep.
Max, can you just remind us who you are and what we're doing?
Sure. So my name is Max Diamond. I'm a transit enthusiast and also a bit of an expert in the field. And I also volunteer in the Transit Museum. And we're taking a ride on the Q line from Coney Island, Stillwell Avenue, which is the origin station, all the way to Astoria Ditmars. So from the first stop to the last stop, we're going to point out some interesting historical facts along the route, some things you may not notice, even if you take the Q train every day. Definitely something that would interest a lot of daily commuters. So right now we're almost at Neck Road. A lot of the local stations along the Brighton line, which is the line that we're on now, have been heavily rebuilt. And as a result, they all look very similar to each other. So Neck Road is going to be one of many similar looking stations that you have the same design windscreen walls, and all the platforms are of a similar design. So we have Neck Road and Avenue U and Avenue M, Avenue J. Very homogeneous, but also very
This is
efficient.
a Manhattan-bound Q local train. The next stop is Avenue U.
All right. And now once in a while we may be passed by an express train. The B is running express and we're the local train. Once in a while there'll be some sort of track work or station construction, and the Q will run on the express track, but today no diversions at all, at least not yet, or nothing planned. So we're on the local train, on the local track. And you'll see as we pull into Avenue U, it almost looks exactly the same as Neck Road. There's definitely cost savings that you could get from sharing components between different stations. And that's not just true today. Even in the 1950s, 1940s, 1970s, whenever a station was rebuilt, they'd often use the same components. And you could actually really tell when a station was rebuilt or built by how the walls look.
What neighborhood are we in right now?
So right now, I guess you could say we're in Midwood, or the southern part of Midwood. Say again?
What borough is that?
Oh, this is Brooklyn. We're in South Brooklyn. Definitely not Williamsburg. That's a different side of Brooklyn. And we're traveling north. So we're going to hit Midwood, and eventually we're going to get up to downtown Brooklyn and then cross the Manhattan Bridge. We're going to pass through a couple of other neighborhoods like Park Slope as we keep going north. Now, yeah, we want to turn to the other side. So now we're approaching Kings Highway. Kings Highway is an express station, so it has two island platforms. The local stations have these side platforms, so only the local trains will actually be against the platform when they stop. But here you have island platforms that are between the express and local tracks on each side. And south of the station, we're kind of encountering some bumps. We're passing over some switches that can move trains from one track to another. So if anything were to happen, they could use those switches to turn us back in the other direction. And once in a while, they'll do construction north of here and have a shuttle that'll go from Coney Island to Kings Highway. It'll use that infrastructure. All right. Yeah. Let's move up a little bit.
This is a Manhattan-bound Q local train. The next stop is Avenue M.
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
There's very few stations with staircases right at the end, so you'll often have a lot of open space up at the front of the train. You can also see out the front. Different types of trains will afford a slightly different view. This train has what's called a full width cab, so the operator's cabin occupies the entire front of the train. And you can kind of see through these two layers of polarized glass. There's the cab door window, and then there's the window at the actual front of the train. Some of the older cars have what's called a quarter cab, or the colloquialism kind of changes depending on who you talk to. It's either a quarter cab or a half cab, but essentially the operator's cabin will only occupy the right third of the train. Why it's called a quarter or a half cab when it's a third, I don't know, but that's just what they call it. But as a result, the front window of the train is directly accessible to anyone who's in the passenger area who would like to see out the front. That affords some great views. I personally have put a GoPro on the front of one of those windows and recorded entire runs from one end of the line to the next. But that's also a New York, I guess you could call it a New York institution that's dying out. The newer trains are all full width, and eventually the half cab trains will be no more, but not anytime soon, at least not in the next 3 years. So if you didn't know that this was Avenue M, you would think it's Neck Road. Most of these local stations look the same.
Avenue J.
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
And what's interesting is, these stations were rebuilt maybe about 5 years ago. But before they were rebuilt, they also looked the same before they were rebuilt. But they all looked like 70s stations instead of, 2010 era stations. So I guess, what goes around comes around. So if we look out the side over here, we're gonna come up on it soon. There is a branch of the Long Island Railroad that is not used for passengers, and that's called the Bay Ridge branch. They only use it for freight, and we actually pass over the Bay Ridge branch at approximately a 90-degree angle. And at one point in time, that was a very heavily used, branch of the Long Island Railroad. It had a lot of tracks. It was electrified with overhead wire. Now it's been reduced to one track, and only diesel trains run on it. And if I'm correct, we will pass over it between Avenue J, which is what we're arriving at now, and Avenue H. It's another cookie cutter local station. But the local stops are very important, even though one local stop may not have a lot of ridership. In aggregate, once you get further north, these local stops combine to provide a lot of passengers.
Local train. The next stop is Avenue H.
All right.
Clear of the closing doors,
Cool.
please.
So if we look out the window, we'll see the Bay Ridge branch. We pass over it at a pretty high elevation compared to the Bay Ridge branch, because the Bay Ridge branch is depressed into the ground, and we're on this kind of elevated embankment. And it's very brief. If you blink your eye, you won't see it. Let's see here. Just gotta wait for a break in the houses. Okay. Oh wait, hold on. I don't remember if it's before. Oh, now you can't see it. I forgot. So we pass over the Bay Ridge branch, but it's the station, Avenue H, goes over the right of way now. And you used to be able to see it from the station, but you can't anymore, because ever since it was rebuilt. That's a bit of a shame. But if you were to leave the station, you would be able to see this railroad. Now, Avenue H may look like any other local station, but it's actually kind of unique. There is a original station house that is used as a fare control at Avenue H, and it's actually on the National Register of Historic Places. So when they rebuilt Avenue H, they actually had to repair and restore this really old station house, and you can't really see it from the train very well, but if you were to get off the train at Avenue H, you'll know that you're in this late 1800s era station house that's been modernized. Yeah. So we are right around here. We're entering Newkirk Plaza. So now we're actually going into what's called an open cut. Before we were on an embankment. And here we're kind of in this depressed sort of cut in the ground. So we're not really underground, but we're below street level.
Transfer is available to the B train.
So you'll still have cell service, but it'll cut in and out, depending on where you are. All right, it's another express station. Newkirk Plaza was very recently rebuilt. It used to be called Newkirk Avenue before the rebuild, and they really ripped out everything. Total replacement of almost all the components here. Now, what's kind of cool about all these stations is that, when the line was originally built, trains were shorter. And in the 1950s and 1960s, they actually had to extend the platforms of almost all of the subway stations to fit a modern-length train, which on the letter lines is 600 feet on almost all the letter lines. And in most stations were relatively easy to extend if they were above ground, but in these open cut stations, it was a bit of an undertaking. They had to, cut into these retaining walls and basically chip them back, in some cases for, over 30 to 50 feet. But it's really hard to kind of see where they did that now. The Transit Authority in the 1950s and 60s did a relatively good job of covering up where they did the extension work. So now we're at another local station. This is Cortelli Road, very recently refurbished as well. And it's also the first open cut local station. It's got very narrow platforms. This is where they did the platform extension. It's kind of just wedged in there with a really narrow platform, so you could barely walk on it, but there's still enough space to be safe as a train arrives.
As I see some graffiti,
Yes.
which, I think we associate with a certain era of
Yeah.
subway.
So yeah, definitely, if you go anywhere really in the New York City subway, what you'll see in the stations is almost no graffiti now. And there's no graffiti on the trains anymore. And the one last place where you'll see graffiti is along the right-of-way, like on retaining walls like this. And that's just something that, I think over time, the MTA has started these new initiatives to clean the trackways more and just clean everything a bit more. So maybe that'll disappear. I guess we'll see. But it is the last kind of vestige of the the dark old days of the 1970s and 80s. But the Brighton line especially has a lot of graffiti along the retaining walls. And actually what was done here at Beverly Road is, at least within the station limits, they've repainted all of the retaining wall. And they've whitewashed all the graffiti away.
Beverly, is this still, what neighborhood is this?
So we're in the very, very northern section of Midwood, almost bordering on Flatbush in a way on one side. And then we're going to get up to Prospect Park, and then after Prospect Park in that area, we're going to transition into Park Slope. So now we're approaching Church Avenue. That's an express station. Church Avenue is kind of interesting. It got this modernization in the 80s where they, covered everything over with this very characteristic 1980s style silver metal plating on the roof. But before they rebuilt Church Avenue, the station looked very similar to a lot of these local stations like Cortelyou. There's actually an abandoned exit at Church Avenue. You can't see it because it's on the other side. But there's just really odd. Oh, actually, there it is. That little white box. That's a staircase. And it's just really odd staircase on one platform that goes to this tiny little landing on the street. But it's been abandoned for a while now. And it doesn't really have much utility. Now it's used as a storage location. All right. And you can see on the roof where they put in this new 80s style, you know, sheath in a way. All right. So we're almost into the tunnel now. We've got 2 more stations. We've got Parkside, which is a local station, and we've got Prospect Park. So what's going to happen now is we have this long underground section here, which is actually just an overpass for a road. And then we're going to go around a slight curve and then into Parkside. So it's kind of the beginning of the afternoon rush hour right now. So we're going to see a high frequency of trains coming in the other direction, carrying people home. It's another overpass. This is kind of an interesting local stop because it's like half underground and half above ground in the open cut. They've kind of integrated the overpass from a road and an apartment building into this station. And actually, this retaining wall right here is another platform extension where they kind of chipped away at the retaining wall, built new platform and new wall to accommodate longer trains.
Clear of the closing doors, please.
So there's some interesting history in this area here. So, and I mentioned a bit earlier that the right-of-way here, the route of this line, dates back all the way to the 1800s. They had a 2-track steam railroad that was actually on the surface. And then in the 1910s and 1920s, they progressively rebuilt it into this really large, heavy-duty, 4-track wide, open cut on the northern section and an embankment on the southern section of the line. And then they actually connected this entire line to a subway line, which would connect to the Manhattan Bridge and then to the Broadway subway in Manhattan. But originally, this line continued north up towards Fulton Street. So we're going to duck down into a tunnel, but on our right, we just switched tracks onto the express track. On our right is the track for the Franklin Shuttle. And the Franklin Shuttle runs along this tiny little piece of trackage from Prospect Park to Franklin Avenue, which is the original route of the line before they connected it to the subway. So they kind of like tapped the subway into a point along the route of this line, and then they were left with this little extra piece that's now used for the shuttle. And the shuttle was actually almost closed. The MTA wanted to abandon it, but then there was so much community pressure to keep it around that they actually rebuilt it completely from the ground up, and now it's actually in very good shape and has, you know, pretty high ridership, you know, proportional to, you know, the amount of subway cars that it uses. And this is kind of a split level station, so we're kind of ducking down into a tunnel now.
Damn, I just peeped. You came always the first thought.
All right.
This is a Manhattan-bound queue.
So we're now officially underground.
The next stop is 7th Avenue.
It's a very, very fast section of tunnel here. Also very deep and very long. There's a lot of distance between stations here. So we're just leaving Prospect Park. And our next stop is going to be 7th Avenue. It's actually a childhood station of mine. I used to live in that area. And 7th Avenue is kind of interesting. It's kind of 7th Avenue Station. 7th Avenue Station is interesting in the sense that it's not flat. It's got a bit of a humped profile. You go uphill and then downhill in both directions. And what actually happened here was you had these two private companies. You had the BMT and you had the IRT. And the IRT is now the number lines. The BMT is now part of the letter lines. And they kind of collaborated and built all of these tunnels that kind of like paralleled each other down Flatbush Avenue. So we're in one of these tunnels, and very soon on our left and on our right, behind the tunnel walls here will be the 2 and 3 trains, and you can't see them. But if you wait for a train at 7th Avenue, you'll often hear rumblings from other trains. That's a 2 or a 3 just behind the wall at that station passing. They kind of picked different stations to stop at. So the BMT had 7th Avenue and the IRT got to stop at Eastern Parkway. They kind of like leapfrog over each other in a way. Very, very interesting tunnel construction.
For people that might just be joining us, can you tell us who you are? What
Sure. So my name is Max Diamond. I'm a transit enthusiast and a bit of an expert in the field. I'm also a volunteer at the Transit Museum. And today we're taking a ride on the Q train from Coney Island, which is the south terminal, to Astoria Ditmars Boulevard, which is the north terminal. We're going to point out some interesting facts and pieces of history that even if you were a person who rode the Q line every day, you may not notice them. And, I think that a lot of people would find these pretty interesting. So now we're at 7th Avenue. 7th Avenue is also kind of cool because it has a closed mezzanine. So this is an open staircase, that you could use to enter the station. But on the other side of the station, there's a gated off staircase, and it just goes up to a mezzanine that's dark and gated off, and you can't really use it. A lot of mezzanines like that were closed in the 1980s and 90s to combat crime, with the idea being that the less space you had open, the more people were in one area, and the safer everyone was.
So this is Park Slope.
Yeah, we're in Park Slope. And you can actually see they have this kind of 1950s, 60s style tile here. This is where they did a platform extension to fit the longer trains. You'll notice that all over the system, where at the very end of a station, the style of the tile on the wall will change. That's almost always where they've kind of extended the station to fit, a modern length train that we'd run today. All right, so now we're heading towards...
Can you see where we are right now?
Yeah, so we're heading towards Atlantic Barclays. That's not the original name of the station. It was originally called Atlantic Avenue Pacific Street. So what's happening here is we have these two subway main lines that join together. You have the modern day D, N, and R, and they come in like this. And then you have the modern day B and Q, and they come in like this, and they merge right after Atlantic Avenue Pacific Street. And the D, N, and R station was originally Pacific Street, and the B and Q station was originally just Atlantic Avenue. So the whole complex was Atlantic Avenue, Pacific Street. And then when they built Barclays Center as part of the Atlantic Yards project, Barclays got naming rights for the whole station complex. So now it's Atlantic Barclays. So all the signs had to be changed, and all the naming, all of the automated announcements had to be changed.
This is where the Nets play somewhere above us.
Yes, the Nets are playing above us. Bon Jovi will have a concert above us. There's hockey. The Islanders will play here. Very, very modern facility. Definitely, big change from what used to be here, which was a rail yard.
This is a Manhattan-bound Q local train. The next stop is...
So we're actually going to pass something kind of interesting, and it's kind of frustrating because I want to be able to show it to you, but it's very, very dark in the tunnel. But what we could try. So the BMT used to run a lot of elevated lines that don't exist anymore. There was an elevated line running above Fulton Street. There was one running above the Lexington Avenue in Brooklyn. And one of the things they thought of doing was connecting these elevated lines to the subway. And that was through what was called the Ashland Place connection. And there's actually, it's very hard to see, but as we start going around this curve, you'll see what looks like an empty tunnel that kind of joins with us. That's a provision for the Ashland Place connection that would have connected these elevated trains to the subway. Just a moment. It's very, very dark, but if you were to go here yourself, you'll be able to see it. All right. There, that empty tunnel right there. I have no idea if it was caught on camera, but if they ever built that connection between the elevated lines and the subway, you would have had this ramp from an above ground elevated train down into the subway that would have joined right there. So we just came around a curve and that line would have kind of joined with us going straight and then would continue into DeKalb Avenue, which is our next stop. You know, lots of things that you'll notice if you just kind of know where to look and when to look out the side of a subway car. And the subway is, you know, is pockmarked with these tunnel headings, you know, provisions for future expansion, you know, little openings in the sides of tunnels and, you know, in upper and lower levels of stations to just kind of plan for future expansion. You know, and if you know where to look, you can easily see it on a train. But obviously I would not condone trespassing or going into a restricted area to see that. It's very dangerous. So this is DeKalb Avenue. We've now merged with the D and an R lines. And this is kind of an interesting station because it has 6 tracks. It's got this outside track, then it's got that track across the platform. That's for trains that'll use what's called the Montague Street Tunnel to go to Lower Manhattan. And then there are 2 tracks in the middle. Those are called the bypass tracks. So the D and the N express trains will use those to bypass DeKalb Avenue. It kind of declogs everything.
We're still looking at the neighborhood.
So now we're in downtown Brooklyn. This is where, you know, near Fulton Mall, near the Transit Museum. Lots of shopping to do around here. All right, so why don't we walk over to that doorway over there and we'll see something that's pretty cool. So the next stop on this train is Canal Street, but between DeKalb and Canal, there used to be another station that was called Myrtle Avenue. And what happened was Myrtle Avenue was abandoned in the 1950s when they totally rebuilt all the tracks and switches north of DeKalb Avenue to make everything a bit more efficient and increase the capacity through this area. And you'll actually see right here, they've installed this artwork. It's called Mass Transiscope. You'll see it again in a moment. There we go. An artist named Bill Brand came up with this in 1980 and installed it here on this abandoned platform. And it's been here ever since. And once in a while it'll get vandalized, but then it'll get restored. That's all, you know, it's a very short platform. So the artwork only stretches for about 200 feet. Now we're actually past the station. But, you know, a lot of people will notice that because it's something, you know, you just happen to be looking out the window and you'll see, oh, look, what is that, you know?
It kind of reminds you of animation.
Yeah, it is. It's very similar technology to, you know, modern animation with, you know, like a flip book or something like that. But instead of flipping the pages, the train is passing static pages. And this concept has actually been used in, you know, cities like Beijing and Berlin for advertising in the subway, where they'll put these things on the walls of the tunnel, and then advertisers can actually buy up space in the tunnel to advertise their products. Something that we haven't done here yet. So there is another interesting thing here in the tunnel. There's no way that we'll be able to see it, but there was a provision for a loop where trains could kind of keep going in this tunnel and go around a loop and then return back to Brooklyn. And by provision, it's like a tiny little, like, you know, wall that just kind of juts out a little bit and then abruptly ends. But, you know, everywhere along the subway there's been forward-thinking planning in case they wanted to do something just a little bit different from what was actually implemented.
Yeah, so what do we got here?
So now we're on the Manhattan Bridge. Very, very interesting structure. The tracks that we're on now are called the Broadway tracks, and the tracks across the road over there, those are the 6th Avenue tracks. So B and D trains that go to the 6th Avenue line will be over there, and the N and Q trains that go to the Broadway line are over here. It's often called the North and the South Side tracks. So right now we're on the south side of the bridge, if I'm correct, yes. And that's the north side of the bridge.
Do you know when this bridge came in?
This bridge, if I'm correct, I think it's either 1907 or 1909. But from the very beginning, this bridge was built with tracks on it, intended for some sort of rapid transit use. But that's also kind of the bridge's Achilles heel. What's happened here is because there are tracks on the sides of the bridge, you basically have heavy trains, you know, pulling and pushing on each side, and that creates all sorts of torsional stresses.
Kind of see the Statue of Liberty.
Yeah, this is a great view. You have the Brooklyn Bridge across from us, which has no train service on it anymore. And you have a good view of Lower Manhattan. There's a lot of development going on there with One World Trade Center and all sorts of buildings being rebuilt, new buildings going up. You know, definitely a good time to be in the real estate market here. So, originally, there was no connection from the Manhattan Bridge to the 6th Avenue subway. Originally, one side of the bridge went to the modern-day JM and Z lines and went to Chambers Street. That connection no longer exists. What happened is, in the 1960s, they basically cut that connection from the bridge to the J line at Chambers Street, and instead hooked this track that we're on now into the Broadway line. And the tracks across from us, which used to hook into the Broadway line, were then connected with a new connection to the 6th Avenue line. And as a result, there's, you know, all sorts of little bits of abandoned tunnel where they've kind of changed how tracks around here connect to each other. And we'll see one. I think we'll be able to see it as we come down the ramp here.
So what neighborhood are we entering right now?
So right now we're going down into Manhattan. This is Chinatown, the Manhattan Chinatown. There are multiple neighborhoods in New York City with large Chinese immigrant populations. This is a very, very vibrant area. There's always a lot going on here every hour of the night. We're actually about to go underground. So if we look out the window here, we'll see the tunnel kind of curves off to the left. That's the original connection to what's now the J line. Let's see if we can see it here. We may not be able to see it because of the wall, because there's walls between the tracks. Yeah, I don't think we're going to be able to see it. If we were going in the other direction, you would see this tunnel that branches off. So now we're on a very steep hill. If you're just joining me, my name is Max Diamond. I am a transit enthusiast and a transit expert, and I volunteer at the Transit Museum. And we're taking a ride on the Q train to kind of learn a little bit more about the history of the line and maybe point out some things that even if you were a regular Q train commuter, you may not have noticed but would find pretty interesting. So we've just entered Manhattan. We're coming down the hill into Canal Street in the heart of Chinatown. And we have to go pretty slow here because it's a very steep hill. So the signals will actually enforce the speed limit going down here. Safety is very important, and what's actually very interesting about the New York City subway is that everything is fail-safe. So it's impossible to exceed the speed limit. If you were to pass a red signal because there was a train in front of you, the emergency brakes would automatically activate. So that's something that's incredibly important to the MTA, is safety, and you see it everywhere. Every speed restriction, everything is done with the safety of passengers in mind. So now we're at Canal Street. I kind of like the mosaics, which kind of reflect the neighborhood we're in, which is Chinatown.
Why moving on post?
So there's another little interesting piece of history here. The Q line is pockmarked with all sorts of provisions for expansion. Originally, the plan was to have this subway line continue going crosstown, and there's actually a little bit of tunnel. You can't really see it, but a little bit of tunnel that keeps going straight while we turn right. That would have been used for this crosstown subway underneath Canal Street. And what's actually kind of cool about this is when this station was first built, the Canal Street station, the mosaics actually said Broadway because it was intersecting with Broadway and would continue crosstown towards the west side. But then when they rebuilt it, it was renamed Canal Street because there is absolutely no chance that they will continue extending this subway line to the west, since they've connected, made it go on this sharp curve and then would connect to Broadway instead. So now we're actually on what's called the Broadway Express. This dates back to the late 1910s. It's the original BRT subway. There were two private companies, the IRT and the BRT. And the BRT is generally the second half of the alphabet when you look at the subway lines. And this is their first subway in Manhattan. It was their flagship line, and when they built it larger and bigger than anything that had been in New York City before. The tunnels were larger, the subway cars they used were larger, they were longer, they had more comfortable seating. Everything was kind of meant to one-up on the IRT, which had built the number lines, and by then had been running what's now the 4, 5, and 6 and the 1, 2, 3 for almost a decade and a half. So the hope was that by building these tunnels larger and making the trains a little more comfortable, the BRT could kind of take away some ridership from the IRT just based off of, amenities and comfort. Whether or not that happened, not really sure. But now because of this, we're stuck with these two separate subdivisions. Because the BRT decided to one-up the IRT, now we have to have different subway cars for different size tunnels. Which is why we have number lines and then letter lines. And it's actually completely operated. It's operated completely separately. You'll never see a letter line train on a number line because the letter line trains are larger and will get stuck, essentially. So we've just passed two local stations. We've passed Prince Street and we've passed 8th Street NYU. And now we're approaching 14th Street Union Square. Massive transfer point, one of the highest ridership stations in the subway. You could connect to the L line to Brooklyn, you could connect to the 4, 5, and 6, which is part of the original subway from 1904. And all these different transfers, plus being situated in a kind of central shopping district, lend itself to having a massive amount of ridership. So now we actually have a N train across the platform. That's an R160 type of car. We're also on an R160. On this line, you'll see R160s on the N and the Q lines, and you'll see R46s on the R line, which are a little bit older. once in a while you'll see something like an R46 on the R or an R68 type car on the N, but that's a little bit less common. Now, when November comes around, which is in about a month because it's October right now, this will all kind of change a little bit, all the service patterns. There used to be a W train, which was discontinued in 2010, but the W is coming back to kind of serve passengers in Astoria that will lose Q service when the 2nd Avenue subway opens. There's kind of this big shift of subway lines from one neighborhood to another. And as a result, you'll no longer have the N, Q, and R, you'll have the N, Q, R, and W. And the N will then run express, the W will run local. It's a bit of a shuffling of the subway lines. But for now, we just have the N, Q, and R. So this is a pretty fast run. Most subway tunnels that are underground have what's called Type 2 track. And Type 2 track is track where the rails are embedded in concrete. That's a bit of a simplification, but essentially you have a concrete base and then these cross ties that are embedded in the concrete, and then the rails are directly connected to those cross ties. What's kind of unique about the Broadway line, which is the line we're on now, is the middle two express tracks are almost all what's called Type 1 track, and that's traditional railroad style track with crushed stone, and wooden cross ties. That's the kind of track you'd see, out on a commuter railroad or on a freight line.
So just tell for folks who may not be from New York,
Sure.
where are we right now? Where are we going?
So right now we're on the Q train. We're going from Coney Island, Stillwell Avenue up to Astoria, Ditmars Boulevard. And we're almost at 34th Street. I'm Max Diamond, and I am a transit enthusiast and a bit of a transit expert, and I volunteer at the Transit Museum. So we're riding the Q to kind of show you guys some things that you may not notice along your commute, some things that are historically significant or interesting. And I bet that once you see this, maybe you'll have a little bit of a better understanding of where to look and what sort of things, go into the operations and construction of a subway line. So this is 34th Street. It's another very, very heavily used station. There's a transfer upstairs to the B, D, F, and M. And it's also underneath Herald Square, so, again, a big, center of ridership. So once in a while, we'll kind of sit here and wait for what's called a lineup. That's when we wait for a clear signal from the train dispatcher, the tower operator. Sometimes trains will get held here if they're running ahead of schedule or if they're very close to the train in front of them to kind of even out the service. That's called gapping. When you gap service, it's when you kind of hold a train back so it doesn't get too close to the train in front of it. And the more even service you have, the better service you have. So now we're no longer being held. The doors will close and we could continue on to Times Square. Of course, Times Square is as many would expect, is a very high ridership station, and we're also in the first car, so we're going to see a lot of people most likely trying to cram onto the train because the staircases are all kind of biased towards the front of the station.
Show us on the map.
If we have a map, I think there's a map over here, but sometimes the maps are covered. There's a map over there. Maybe we could wait. We'll see. Yeah. So now we're actually passing over a switch. We're switching from the express track to the local track. And that may seem a little odd because you'd think the Q as an express train would stay on the express track. But actually what is happening is after 34th Street, we get onto the local side of the line. and then we use that local track to go all the way up to Astoria, because the middle two tracks during the middays are kind of used for train storage. And they're also used to kind of put in these extra rush hour trains that originate in Manhattan instead of coming all the way from Queens. So we kind of have to get out of the way of that. So, you know, we only stop at one extra local station as a result. But that's the price to pay for 5 extra rush hour trains or something like that.
End to end, when things are running smoothly, how long does it usually take to go to travel?
On the Q line, off the top of my head, it's running. That's called running time, the time between one terminal and the other end of the line. It's about 65 to 70 minutes, maybe 80 minutes. And that's, you know, most lines are about that length. Some are a little longer, some are a little shorter. You know, the G line, which is a little shorter, has about maybe 30 to 40 minutes of running time. But the Q, because we go all the way from Coney Island, all the way up through Brooklyn, all the way up to Manhattan, is a bit longer. So, Times Square, we've just arrived here on the Q train. Very, very high ridership station. This is the #1 ridership station in the system. Every single hour of the day, there is a massive amount of people moving through here, transferring from line to line. Oh. You'll often have some delays because people will try to run onto the train as the doors are closing. And the longer the train sits at the station, the longer its dwell time. So a dwell time is the amount of time the train spends sitting without moving at a station. If your dwell time is longer, it means that trains have to wait longer behind you to get into the station. So it's really important to kind of board the train as fast as possible so that the next train can arrive. And the longer your dwell time is, because of passenger crowding, the less capacity there is. So in a way, New Yorkers are kind of a victim of their own, you know, success, in the sense that we have this great subway and we get to use it, but because so many of us are riding it, we actually slow it down and lower the capacity of the subway. That's a big problem, especially on the 4, 5, and 6 lines. So, actually right here, you could kind of see there's a train sitting right there being stored for use in the PM rush hour. There's another one right here. And maybe about half an hour to an hour from now, a train operator will get on board that train and move it into either 57th Street or 42nd Street, where it'll start service. And that's called a put-in, where you kind of take a train and put it into service somewhere along the line. And it's kind of important to be able to dynamically adjust the amount of trains you run on the subway like that. You know, you don't want to run too many trains when not a lot of people are riding, but you want to have a lot of trains when you have a lot of people riding. Yes, this is 49th. We're in the theater district now, lots of Broadway shows. This station has been rebuilt in the 70s with this sort of experimental sound dampening acoustic brick.
The red brick,
Yeah. And basically, they kind of just put the brick in front of the existing tile at the station. So the entire platform has been narrowed by about 6 inches because of the reconstruction. Because they just kind of stacked brick right in front of the wall. But you know, it's a wide platform, so that doesn't pose any problems. So we've just left 49th. And right now we are going to very slowly enter 57th Street. 57th Street is the last northbound stop on the Q train on the weekends, but since it's a weekday, we're going to continue north and go up to Queens, to Astoria. And very, very slow area here, just because there's, you know, a lot of switches, sharp curves north of the station. They don't want us coming in too fast, because if we were to overrun the station, there could be problems with that.
Do they put the curves? Is that intentional, putting those sharp curves in to?
So, basically what's happening here is a lot of different plans have kind of converged north of the station. So this was originally, the last stop on the line, and then very shortly after they extended it north over to Astoria. But the BMT wanted to actually extend this subway line up Central Park West, which is where the A, B, C, and D lines now run. And they wanted to do that so badly that they actually built tunnel north of the station that would ramp up and then would go left towards Central Park. And because of that, they had to have this complex junction north of the station, so trains going to Astoria could go to Astoria, and Central Park trains would go to Central Park, so it's a bit of sharp curves around here. And what's happened is that tunnel structure that the BRT built north of here has actually been repurposed. So those two middle tracks at one point in time would just continue north and they would just stub end, against a wall. But now those tracks have been connected to what's called the 63rd Street connection, and those are the tracks that go from 57th Street to Lexington 63rd on the F, and will eventually become part of the 2nd Avenue subway. So we've kind of changed plans a little bit, but in the end, the infrastructure was used. So we're actually going downhill, and those tracks across from us on the middle have gone uphill. So now we're going to go into 5th Avenue, and we're actually turning. We were going north, now we're going east. We're going to run underneath of 59th Street. Very, very sharp curve, because we have to make a 90-degree curve from, going north to going east. And there are two stations going crosstown here. There's 5th Avenue, which is the station we're almost at, and then after that there's Lexington Avenue. Now, what's kind of interesting about these older BRT subway lines is that they had very intricate mosaics, much more so than some of the more modern subway lines, like the A line, for example, which most of it was built in the 1930s, has a very Spartan Art Deco style tiling with just, maybe 3 colors and that's it. But the older lines, like this line that we're on now, from the late 1910s and early 1920s, have much more intricate tiling, lots of different colors. Generally, as you go farther back in time, the artwork becomes a little bit more sophisticated and more complex.
This is 6th Avenue, 59.
So now we're only 2 tracks. The middle express tracks that we saw at 57th Street are now heading up towards the 2nd Avenue subway.
So we're at 5th Avenue.
Yep. So here we are on the Q train, 5th Avenue and 59th Street. And for those of you just joining us, my name is Max Diamond. I am a transit enthusiast and an expert in the field, and I volunteer at the Transit Museum. Today we're taking a bit of a ride on the Q line from Stillwell Avenue, which is the south terminal, to Astoria Ditmars Boulevard, which is the northern terminal. That's the full length of the Q line, and I'll be pointing out some interesting things along the way, some pieces of history, things that you may not notice, even if you rode the Q every single day. Definitely something where, if you were to ride the Q train after, you definitely notice it every single day. All these little, pieces of history and, provisions for expansion, things like that. And also maybe have a little bit more knowledge of how the subway works. So now we're approaching Lexington Avenue, also under 59th Street, because we're going crosstown. And what's happened at this station is a bit interesting. The planners of this subway line kind of changed their mind as they started construction here. And originally they were going to have 2 tunnels, one under 60th and one under 59th. And they got as far as actually building a station underneath of 59th Street. So right now we're kind of under 60th Street, between 60th and 59th. They built these two separate stations and then decided, you know what, never mind, let's build one combined station for both directions. So now we're in this combined station with both tracks. But that little station that they built for, you know, the outbound direction that they never used still exists. It's just a little storage room. They didn't really get far.
So you talk about the announcers, you know, there's the
Sure. Yes. So one of the, I say most, one of the things that a lot of tourists to New York will kind of realize once they get to the subway is there's a very distinctive announcer voice. You know, there's some, you know, this guy always saying, "Stand clear of the closing doors, please," and that's actually the person who says that. His name is Charlie Pellet, and he works for Bloomberg Radio. And when we got these new trains in the very late 90s, in 1999, they came with this automated announcement system. And before then, all the trains had manual announcements where the conductor would go on basically a PA system and would, you know, say the route of the train by themselves. But these new trains had a computerized announcement system, so they went to Bloomberg Radio and had their staff record every station stop, every possible announcement that you could ever need for a subway train. And now we have this really large library of all sorts of, you know, different announcements, every station, you know, different transfers, special announcements like this. This is a Charlie Pellet announcement, but there are other people who have voiced for the New York City subway, female and male. I don't remember any other names off the top of my head, but there's at least 4 or 5 different unique announcers, and it really depends on what line you are. You know, on the F line they have one announcer, the 4 line they have another announcer. The N line has a different group of people. And what kind of sets the New York City subway apart from other subways is that other systems have often used voice synthesis or like a text-to-speech software for their announcements. But here there are, you know, recordings for everything. They've had real people come in and take their own recordings for everything. And personally, I feel that sounds much better. And I think that the, you know, announcements like "Stand clear of the closing doors" have even become a fixture in, you know, New York City lexicon in a way. Even the inflection and the way that Charlie Pellet says that announcement is so distinctive.
So where are we right now?
So we've just gone through the 60th Street tunnel that goes under the East River from Manhattan to Queens. So we're going up a very steep ramp up into Queensboro Plaza, and these girders that you see in front of you, those are the girders for the approach ramps to the Queensboro Bridge. That's a vehicular bridge, but at one point in time it used to carry elevated trains. It used to carry the 2nd Avenue elevated across to Queens. And the tracks from that elevated line are still sort of visible. You could see the ironwork that would have connected to the bridge from this station. But we don't run trains over the bridge anymore. And here we are at Queensboro Plaza. Across the platform is the 7 train. So this is actually unique in being the only place where you can connect across the platform from a letter line train to a number line train. There's nowhere else in the system where you can do this. And it's also the only track connection between the 7 line and the rest of the subway system. There's a switch that connects these 2 tracks here. It's also a very high ridership station.
This is an Astoria Bismarck Boulevard bound Q
Yeah,
local
let's
train.
make
The
some
next stop
room.
is 39th Avenue.
A lot of people will get off here to transfer to the 7 train. The 7 connects to Flushing and Woodside and a lot of other neighborhoods out in Queens, Jackson Heights. Very, very high ridership line, and the MTA is doing a lot of modernization on it. So,
development here.
oh yeah, and a lot of development here as well. Queens is a very rapidly growing borough. So we'll see, actually behind you is that switch that connects. This is the 7's only connection to the rest of the subway. So anytime, we need to transfer a 7 train from, from the 7 line to another portion of the system, you have to go across that. It's the only doorway. So the 7's going to keep going straight. We're going to ramp up a little bit and then turn left. And you could see some kind of ironwork down here. It looks like subway tracks used to run there. Queensboro Plaza used to be much larger because it would connect to that 2nd Avenue elevated line. So there's a lot of old ironwork from, other parts of the station that no longer exist. Now these are the Sunnyside rail yards. That's, where they store New Jersey Transit trains, Amtrak trains, Long Island Railroad. And this is actually a facility for East Side Access, which is the tunnel that Long Island Railroad is using, or will use, to get to Grand Central. That is a mega project. You can almost think of it as New York City's Big Dig. Absolutely massive. I think it's been going on for as long as I've been alive, but the benefits will be amazing. So now we're taking a little bit of a curve, and we're arriving at 39th Avenue. So this looks a little bit different if you watch the entire clip. This looks a little bit different from some of the elevated stations we saw all the way at the beginning of the line out in Brooklyn. This is an older style elevated station that has not been rebuilt recently. This kind of white windscreen is very emblematic of the 1970s. It's not original. This is a 1970s rebuild, so it'll have this 1970s mezzanine and the 1970s windscreen.
Clear of the closing doors, please.
Now, just like a lot of local stations out in Brooklyn, most of these Astoria line stations look very similar to each other. They all have the 1970s style windscreen. And this sort of white ribbed station wall that you'll see at these stations is almost another New York institution in a way. And until recently, almost all of the above ground stations on the New York City subway had this same exact style of wall. But as stations get rebuilt, it's kind of disappearing. So this is another example of it with this kind of ribbed white station wall. And then at the end, they have a low railing.
So in Queens, are we in Astoria yet?
Yes. So we're kind of coming up into the Astoria neighborhood in Queens. We've crossed the East River through a tunnel and came up into Long Island City, and we've taken a left. Now we're in the Astoria neighborhood.
Closing doors, please.
We've got just a couple more stops to go. Now this construction here, this is also what we would call dual contracts construction, where the two private companies, the IRT and the BRT, collaborated and built structures that they either shared or made sure that one company would get one line and they wouldn't interfere with the other company. In the case of this line specifically, IRT trains, which are current, modern day number line trains, actually used to run up here, and trains run by the BRT would sometimes run out to Flushing on the 7 line. But when they connected the subway to this line, the subway trains were a bit wider, so they dedicated this line for the subway trains and what's now the modern day 7 line for the older elevated trains, which were the same dimensions as the number line trains we have today. It's almost remarkable how ubiquitous these station designs are. You could go from one station to the next, and the components are very, very similar to each other.
Local train. The next stop is 30th Avenue.
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.
All right. So we're actually on an elevated structure, and for those of you just joining me, my name is Max Diamond. I'm a transit enthusiast and a transit expert, and I also volunteer at the New York Transit Museum. And today we're just kind of taking a short trip on the Q line from one end of the line to the other to kind of show you some things that you may not really notice on your daily commute. Point out some interesting historical tidbits and other information that most New Yorkers may not know. So, this is an elevated structure. We're out here in Queens in the Astoria neighborhood. It's 3 tracks. The outer 2 tracks are normally used for passenger service. The middle track is, I guess you could call it an express track, but it's not normally used. On weekends, you may be on an N train that would use this middle track to bypass stations in either direction because of construction. But the normal service pattern doesn't have this middle track being used because it doesn't really stop at a lot of stations. Most of these stations are local stops, so it doesn't really help you at any of these stations to have a train coming down the middle track.
Astoria Boulevard.
Stand clear of the closing doors,
And actually
please.
the next station is Astoria Boulevard. That's the only express station on this line. We have Astoria Boulevard and then Ditmars Boulevard. 2 station names that often get confused with each other because they're both boulevards. We're gonna kind of go on this hill that goes up and then curves a little bit to the right, and then we go down a steep hill into Astoria Boulevard.
What's your favorite station? Do you have one?
Yeah, my favorite station on the subway would probably be, that's a really hard question, but I think my favorite station would have to be Broadway Junction on the J line, just because there's so much history there and crisscrossing tracks and ironwork. Very, very complex area, a lot of history. So there we have the highway underneath of us, which was actually built after this line. They kind of dug an open trench and depressed the road in there. And then this is Astoria Boulevard right here. So we have one more stop. Off there in the distance, behind the train, is the RFK Bridge, originally called the Triborough Bridge. It connects Queens, Manhattan, and the Bronx with 3 separate spans. And I think we could see it as we leave the station here. Yeah, you could see the suspension bridge, the suspended part of the RFK Bridge out there in the background. And you could also use that bridge to get to Randall's Island, which is this island that is kind of under the intersection of the 3 parts of the RFK Bridge. And then on the right, you could kind of see this arch bridge through the trees. That's called the Hell Gate Bridge. And the Hell Gate Bridge is actually a railroad bridge, and that carries freight trains and Amtrak passenger trains heading up to Boston. There's a lot of proposals for some sort of subway line that would use that bridge to kind of connect different outer boroughs, connect the Bronx to Queens and Brooklyn without going through Manhattan, but nothing has come of the proposal yet. And it's a really long viaduct going all the way across the Hell Gate and then all the way down into Queens. So here we are. This is Ditmars Boulevard. It's the last stop. What we've done is we've crossed over to the other track, to the southbound track, so that when we were to continue going south in the other direction, we could just head straight out of here. If we were to come in on the other side, on the other track, we would have to use that switch to get to the southbound track when leaving the station. And that's kind of the way that trains turn around. They use these switches to get onto the proper track when they either enter or leave the terminal station. Now this is kind of unique in being the only island platform station on the Astoria line. All the other stations are either these express stations like Astoria Boulevard with 2 island platforms, or side platform stations like 39th Avenue. And there's some cool things to see here actually. Now, a question that a lot of people will have is, why is it when I get to the last stop, the train sits for a long time before the doors open? You'll see it right here. We've stopped, but we're gonna wait a couple seconds before the doors open. That actually happens for a reason. The conductor, which is in the middle of the train, conductor controls the doors. The conductor has to switch from one cab to the other. There's 2 cabs in the center of the train. So to open the doors at the last stop, the conductor has to switch to one side before opening the doors. So there's a bit of a delay, but not too long, not unreasonable. So this is Astoria. If you look above, that is the Northeast Corridor, which connects to the Hellgate Bridge.
Are those train tracks up there?
Yeah, and you can actually see it's electrified with overhead wire, so electric trains will run up there. That's where you have like your Amtrak Acela trains, your Amtrak regional trains that go up to Boston. And it connects to that Hellgate Bridge that we pointed out a little bit earlier, and you can actually see it right through the trees there. And it really is, I mean, this really is the end of the line. I mean, the track just kind of ends here. That yellow device is called a bumper block. So if a train were to come in too fast and fail to stop, that bumper block would kind of keep the train from overrunning and falling to the street, or at the very least, slow it down before falling to the street. And I guess that's about it. We've gone on the entire Q line. We went from Stillwell Avenue all the way up to Ditmars Boulevard, and we've pointed out all sorts of things that you may not really notice, or may have been curious about, or may not have known that you didn't know. So once again, my name is Max Diamond. I'm a transit enthusiast and a transit expert, and I volunteer at the Transit Museum, and we have kind of pointed out all sorts of interesting historical tidbits. And if you have any questions, I'm sure that in the comments you can ask them, and I hope you tune in again. Thanks.